The wind carried the last light of day across the prairie, turning the sky into ribbons of rose and copper. A single figure moved against that vastness, Elias Boone, hands rough from the plow, shoulders bent beneath years of solitude. His fields whispered with the sound of wheat swaying, but his house stood silent, a hollow place without laughter. Loneliness clung to him like dust. It seeped into his bones, sat heavy in the chair across the table, and stared back at him from the empty side of his bed. The world was wide, yet his life had narrowed to furrows in the earth and the ache of a heart grown too used to silence. Down in town, another figure had arrived, a woman with her chin held steady, though her body trembled with weariness. Clara Mayfield guided her little girl through the street, the child's hand swallowed up in hers. Their shoes carried the story of miles walked, their dresses carried the story of winters endured. Faces turned as they passed. Whispers rose like nettles in their wake. Clara's husband had left nothing but debts behind him, and debts have long memories in small towns. She looked for kindness, a door that might open, but found only turned shoulders and narrowed eyes. Lydia, no more than 8, peered up at her mother with hunger in her gaze, though she spoke no word. At the boarding house, Eleanor Pike met Clara's request with a thin smile and a sharpened tongue. "Can't pay, can't stay," she said, her apron crisp, her eyes full of scorn. "This ain't a charity for the likes of you." The words stung deeper than the evening chill. That night, Clara curled her daughter against her outside the livery stable, their blanket too thin for the cold that crept in. The girl shivered, and Clara wrapped herself around her child like armor. Boots scuffed past in the dark. Elias Boone headed home. He paused, the glow of the lantern catching the sight of mother and daughter folded against the earth. His jaw tightened, but he said nothing, only moved on, though the image rooted itself inside him like a thorn. By morning, the sheriff himself made his appearance. Amos Hart, a man whose voice carried the weight of the town, told Clara what she already feared. She could not linger without work, without a way to keep her child fed. Words of law were words of exile. Just as Clara bowed her head, the scrape of boots came again. Elias Boone stepped forward, his voice low, steady, as though each word had been plowed from the soil itself. "Your daughter needs a home," he said, eyes meeting Clara's, "and my bed needs you." Shock lit her face, a flare of anger rising quick. She thought at first he meant indecency, another burden she would not bear. But his voice held no hunger, only weariness wrapped in sincerity. "I mean a wife," he said simply. "My farm is too big for one man. You'd have a roof, food, safety. Nothing more, unless you choose it." The words hung in the air heavier than a gunshot. Clara's pride battled with desperation, her heart pulled taut between refusal and her daughter's wide, pleading eyes. Silence stretched, and then she nodded once sharp and small, as though the word yes had burned her tongue. The wagon rolled out of town carrying them to their new life. Clara sat stiff, Lydia pressed against her, her small fingers reaching for every new sight along the road. Elias drove with the quiet patience of a man long used to silence. When a house came into view, it stood sturdy, solid against the horizon, but it was joyless, a place that had not known the sound of a child's laugh in years. Within its walls, shadows seemed to wait, corners still and untouched. That night, in a bed that was no longer strange, but not yet hers, Clara lay awake beneath beams blackened with age. Her daughter breathed soft at her side, already dreaming. But Clara stared into the dark, her heart thudding with gratitude laced in humiliation. Safety had been bought at the price of pride, and the walls seemed to listen as she whispered her silent vow, to endure for her child's sake. The mornings began in silence. Elias rose before the sun, the floorboards creaking beneath his boots, the scent of coffee rising faintly in the kitchen. Clara listened from her bed, the sound of his movements foreign, almost startling. Days passed with a rhythm as steady as his plow. He worked the fields until sweat darkened his shirt, and she tended to the hearth and the table, her hands remembering chores she had not performed for years. Lydia trailed between them like a small bird, fluttering near her mother, darting after Elias with cautious curiosity. The house no longer stood empty, but it still felt hollow, each of them walking like strangers in borrowed rooms. It was not cruelty that filled the silence, but something gentler, harder to name. Elias never pressed, never reached beyond what was offered. Yet when his gaze lingered on Lydia, laughter pulling at her lips as she found kittens in the barn. Something in his eyes softened, and Clara noticed. Each time they entered town, whispers gathered like storm clouds. Women clutched baskets tighter, men tipped hats with smirks. She bought her bread with her body, someone murmured too loudly outside the general store. Clara burned with shame, but her jaw set like stone. For Lydia's sake, she bore it. Then one evening, Lydia's small body burned with fever. Clara's heart clenched as she pressed a damp cloth to her daughter's brow, tears slipping despite her will. Elias entered quietly, his shadow long against the doorway. Without a word, he knelt, his hands rough but gentle as he replaced the cloth, fetched herbs from a jar, measured water with steady patience. Through the long night, he sat by Lydia's side, reading softly from the worn leather Bible he kept on the mantel. Clara watched him in the lantern's glow, and in that light, he was not just a farmer hardened by solitude. He was a man who knew tenderness. When dawn broke, the fever eased. Lydia slept deeply, cheeks flushed with returning color. She stirred once, whispering, "Mama, he's kind. Don't leave." Clara's throat ached with the words she could not speak. The following Sunday, they went to church. Lydia clutched Clara's hand, her dress washed and mended. But the air inside was heavy with judgment. Eleanor Pike's voice cut sharper than any sermon. Some women climb into a bed quicker than into a coffin. Laughter tittered in corners. Clara's face flushed scarlet, humiliation burning hotter than any fever. She turned to flee, but Elias stepped forward, his voice ringing steady, low but strong enough to silence the room. "Say what you will of me," he said, his eyes fixed on Eleanor, "but don't speak ill of a mother who keeps her child warm." The hush that followed carried more weight than any hymn. Clara looked at him then with new eyes, this man who chose to bear her shame upon his shoulders without asking anything in return. But gossip does not die so easily. One night, under a sky heavy with summer heat, shadows crept to the edge of Elias's wheat fields. A cruel hand struck a match. Flames licked upward, spreading fast through the dry stalks. Elias woke to the smell of smoke, the crackle of fire splitting the silence. He ran into the fields, shouting for water. Clara followed, skirts gathered in her fists, Lydia stumbling after with buckets half her size. The night roared with orange and black, heat blistering the air. Together they fought, Elias with his strength, Clara with her resolve, Lydia passing what she could. Sparks stung Clara's arms, but she pressed on, side by side with Elias, neither yielding. At one moment the wind shifted, fire sweeping toward them. Elias pulled Clara close, shielding her body with his own, teeth gritted against the flames. By dawn, the fire lay smoldering, half the wheat turned to ash. The farm bore its scars. Elias stood blackened with soot, sweat streaking his face, and Clara, her hands blistered, leaned against him. Lydia slept curled in a blanket nearby, exhaustion heavy upon her small frame. In the stillness after ruin, Elias reached for Clara's hand. This time she did not draw away. Her fingers trembled, but she held on. Ash drifted through the air like snow as she whispered, "This isn't shame, this is home." The days that followed were not easy, but they were different. Clara rose early, not out of duty but of choice, cooking with care that spoke of belonging. Elias repaired what he could, his steps lighter with the presence of voices in the house. Lydia laughed more freely, chasing chickens in the yard, her joy the music that softened the walls. The farm had lost half its wheat, but gained something richer, a family stitched together not by blood or convenience, but by fire, endurance, and quiet grace. And so the story settles at dawn, Clara standing on the porch with the horizon wide before her. Lydia sleeps safe within, Elias beside her, a man who had learned to open the locked room of his heart. The sky blushes with light, not sudden but slow, the kind that warms wood and bone alike. And as the narrator's voice leans toward you, it speaks not only of Clara and Elias, but of us all. Sometimes love is not a thunderclap but a slow dawn. It arrives in silence, in the small acts of grace that carry us through. And when the world whispers of shame, remember this: dignity can grow even from ashes, and every heart deserves a shelter to call its own.